At 5:25 on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the village of Hürtgen, sitting on the German border in eastern Belgium, stopped being a quiet place. The first rounds arrived across the entire front line at once. Artillery and rocket fire, walking through the foxholes of the 3rd Battalion of the 395th Infantry. 600 men holding a frontage meant for a great deal more than 600 men. Within minutes, every telephone line in the battalion was cut. A single minute of that fire told the men in the holes everything they needed to know. The Germans were not registering. They were not probing. They knew precisely where the American line was, and they were standing on it. In a forward command post, a staff officer of the 99th Division listened to dirt shake down from the ceiling and made a joke that outlived the war. Army intelligence had assured them the enemy had 2 horse-drawn guns in the entire sector. They sure are working those 2 poor horses to death. Hold on to that joke. Not because it's funny, because of what it tells you about the men underground that morning. More than 1,000 German guns were firing along an 80-mile front, and inside the frozen earth, under logs and sod, Americans were cracking wise. At 5:55, the shelling lifted. Then the sky went pale. German searchlights, angled up into the low cloud, bounced an artificial moonlight down onto the snow. And out of that gray glare came the infantry of the 753rd Volksgrenadier Regiment, advancing at 5 separate points. Everything the German plan required had already happened. The line had been shelled. The wire had been cut. The defenders had spent half an hour with their heads down in the dark. By every rule of war as the German army understood it, the men in those holes should have been stunned, scattered, deafened, and slow. They were none of those things. The American line opened up at ranges where nobody misses. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and men firing rifles from the lip of a hole at figures 30 feet away. Some of the grenadiers were hit so close that they fell forward into the American foxholes, and the rest of that particular argument was settled with hands and rifle butts. The ones who reached the village streets were hunted out of the houses, and once the wire was patched, the artillery came down on the open ground behind them and stayed there. By the end of that first day, roughly 200 Germans lay dead in front of Hürtgen, and 19 more were prisoners. The battalion that killed them lost 4 men. If you find yourself wanting more stories like this one, American units that history filed away as a footnote, hitting like genuinely helps this reach the people who care about them. Subscribe if you'd like to come along. 4 dead. Against an attack by a division, opening with a bombardment that severed every telephone line the defenders owned. Now hold 2 facts side by side, because this entire story lives in the space between them. The German fire was good. It landed on the American positions. Not near them, on them. Those gunners had studied that ground for weeks, and their opening barrage did exactly what it was designed to do. It blanketed the line. It cut the communications. It arrived as a complete surprise. And it changed nothing. 2 days later, the arithmetic around Hürtgen had grown stranger still. American graves teams counted 554 German dead in and around the village. 53 more were taken prisoner. Against that, 5 Americans killed and 7 wounded. I want to be very clear about something before we go any further, because it will save you from the wrong answer. This is not a story about German incompetence. The men firing those guns were professionals from an army that had been perfecting indirect fire since 1914. They had broken the French. They had broken the Poles. On the Eastern Front, they had reduced fortified cities to gravel. When a German artillery officer said he could put steel on a map coordinate, he could. And that is what makes the patterns so strange. Because Hürtgen was not a fluke. Go looking through German after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, and the post-war accounts written by German commanders in Allied custody, and you keep finding the same complaint, worded a dozen different ways, from Normandy to the Rhine. We shelled them. We hit them. We saw the impacts land in their positions. And then their line fired back. A German battery commander could watch through his instruments as his rounds walked across an American company. He could see the earth lift. He could see men go down. And 40 minutes later, that same American company would be shooting at his infantry. And, this is the part that ruined careers, American shells would be arriving on his own guns. So here's the question this whole investigation turns on, and it is a more difficult question than it first appears. What exactly would the Germans have had to destroy in order to knock an American position out of the fight? Not damage it, not bloody it. Knock it out. Make it stop being a thing that kills Germans. The obvious answer comes fast, and it's the one most people reach for. The Americans dug deep. Deep holes, log roofs, sandbags, reverse slopes. Cover beats shrapnel. That's a real answer. It's also a real part of what happened at Hürtgen, where the dugouts were well built, and the casualties from that opening barrage were remarkably light. But hold that answer loosely, because it collapses the moment you test it. It collapses because 1 month before Hürtgen, in a forest barely 40 miles to the south, the German army had already solved the American Foxhole. Completely. They had found a way to make a hole in the ground worse than useless. A way to kill men who were doing everything right, doing it by the book, deep and covered and quiet. It worked. It worked so well that it cost the United States Army more than 30,000 casualties in a stretch of woods that appears on no strategic map worth the name. The Germans knew how to knock out an American position. They had proved it. So what happened between that forest in November and the searchlights at Hürtgen in December? November 16th, 1944. A forest on the German-Belgian border. 50 square miles of fir trees packed so tightly that a man could lose his platoon at 20 yards. Gray clouds sitting on the treetops. A steady drizzle coming down through the branches. That morning, the rifle companies of the 22nd Infantry Regiment rolled up their blankets and ate a hot breakfast. It would be their last hot meal for 18 days. Their commander was Colonel Charles Lanham, West Point, class of 1924, a man who led from the front and expected everyone under him to do the same. Less than a mile away, German infantry of the 275th Division were easing out of their bunkers into the wet dark, listening for exactly the attack that was coming. Now, everything you learned about American positions in the last few minutes, the deep holes, the discipline, the light casualties under heavy shelling, I need you to set it down for a while. Because in this forest, none of it worked. Here is what happened to a man in a hole in the Hurtgen. He did everything correctly. He dug deep, he kept below ground level. He heard the round coming and he got down. And every instinct he had trained into himself told him that the earth on either side of his shoulders was about to save his life. And then the shell never reached the ground. It struck the crown of a 100-foot fir tree, 30 feet above him, and detonated there. Steel came down. But not only steel, the tree came apart as well, and the wood became a second weapon, splinters driving downward like nails, whole limbs and trunks falling on men who were pinned in place by their own good discipline. A hole in the ground protects you from fragments traveling sideways. Against fragments traveling straight down, a hole is not cover. A hole is a container. That is the German counter to the American foxhole. And I want you to understand that it was not luck. Every part of that forest had been pre-registered by German artillery observers, square by square, weeks in advance. They did not need to see you. They needed only to know which square you were in, and the trees did the aiming for them. The Americans had no experience of this. Many of the German troops holding the woods had fought in the forests of Russia and Finland, and knew precisely what a tall stand of timber does to an artillery shell. The GIs learned it the way you learn things in a war, which is to say afterwards, from the men who didn't. A sergeant of the 22nd's 1st Battalion, George Morgan, later put the place into a few sentences that have stayed in the record ever since. "You couldn't recover all your dead," he said, "because you couldn't find them. You couldn't get protection. You couldn't see. Artillery came through the trees like a scythe, and after each new attack, there was only a handful of the old men left." And within that, ordinary men kept doing extraordinary arithmetic with their own lives. Private First Class Francis McGraw of the 26th Infantry was firing a machine gun into a German counterattack when a shell dropped a tree directly across his field of fire. So he climbed out of his hole, in the open, under that fire, and moved the gun past the log. A near burst threw the weapon into the air and knocked him down. He got up, retrieved it, and went back to firing until the ammunition was gone. Now the price. The 22nd Infantry took 2,678 casualties, the highest of any single regiment in the entire campaign. The 4th Infantry Division had to be pulled off the line to be rebuilt from scratch. And a few miles away, another outfit was being taken apart in the same way. In the fighting on the fringe of that forest in early December, the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry, 1st Division, the Big Red 1, lost Companies E and F almost entirely. Company G was shattered. Of the officers on the battalion roster at the start of December, 7 would still be there at the end of the month. Remember that battalion. Remember that number, 7. It is going to walk back into this story in about 20 minutes, and when it does, it is going to do something that should not have been possible. But the Hurtgen matters here for one reason above all others. It is the proof that the German army knew how to knock out an American position. Not in theory, in practice, at scale, for 6 weeks, at a cost of more than 30,000 American casualties. When German gunners were given the right ground and time to prepare it, they could reach into holes and kill the men inside them. So the Americans adapted, and they adapted in the crudest way imaginable, because there was nothing else available. Where the advance stopped, men cut timber and roofed their holes. Logs across the top, then sod, then whatever else came to hand. If the shell was going to burst above you, then you built a lid. That is the fix that carried into December. That is why the dugouts at Hürtgen were described as deep and log-covered, and why the casualties from that opening barrage were so light. And it is only half an answer, possibly less than half. Because here is what a log roof does not explain. At Hürtgen, the German barrage cut every telephone line the battalion had. Overhead cover does not repair a severed wire. Overhead cover does not tell you where the enemy is forming up in the dark. Overhead cover does not put 554 German soldiers into the frozen ground in front of a village in 3 days. A lid keeps men alive. It does not, by itself, keep a position killing. And killing is the whole question. A position that survives but cannot hurt you has been knocked out just as surely as one that has been wiped off the map. The Germans did not need those men dead. They needed them silent. So what made an American position keep firing? For that, we have to go back 4 months and about 400 miles to a rock outcrop in Normandy, where 700 Americans were cut off, surrounded, out of food, out of ammunition, and out of medicine, and where the answer turned out to be something that was not on the hill at all. 6 a.m., August 7th, 1944. A steep, stony hill above the Norman town of Mortain. The French call it Montjoie, because pilgrims coming over the crest used to catch their first sight of Mont Saint-Michel, 27 miles west. To the Americans, it was Hill 314, after its height in meters. Sentries had just reported 400 German soldiers climbing the eastern slope in the dark. Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss, 21 years old, was lying among the boulders with a pair of field glasses on a tripod and a 35-pound radio in a leather case. He was wearing the wool serge shirt his father had worn in the First World War. His radio had a range of 5 miles, just enough to reach the howitzer batteries dug into the west. It ran on batteries that were already dying and could not be replaced. He could not see the Germans, so he called his first fire mission by sound and by map coordinate, in the dark, on an enemy he could only hear. 700 Americans were on that hill. Most of the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry, 30th Division, plus attachments. Overnight, tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Division had rolled through Mortain below them and cut them off completely. The battalion had bazookas and mortars and not much else. What it had instead were 2 forward observer teams from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. Weiss ran one. Lieutenant Charles Bartz ran the other. Both had spent the previous day plotting fires across the ground below them, which is a small detail that decided a great deal. Now, the German commanders had a clean, correct problem in front of them, and they understood it perfectly. Until Hill 314 was eliminated, the southern arm of their entire counteroffensive was going nowhere. The men on that hill could see from horizon to horizon. Every road, every crossroads, every column of vehicles moving west toward the sea lay open beneath them. As one of the American company commanders, Lieutenant Ralph Curley, put it in his report, the German formations were closed up tight, and that made them a definite target. So the Germans did what any competent army does. They shelled the hill. For 6 days and nights they shelled it, along with mortars, along with tank fire, along with infantry assaults by a regiment-sized force of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division coming up the slopes. This was not harassing fire. This was a serious, sustained, professional effort to erase a battalion from a piece of high ground by an army that had every reason in the world to want it gone. Watch what it achieved. Over 300 of those 700 men were killed or wounded. More than half the officers who started were gone. Among the injuries the surgeons later catalogued were wounds caused not by steel, but by rock. Shells bursting on the outcrops turned the hill itself into fragments. They ran out of food. They ran out of ammunition. They ran out of radio batteries, which, for Weiss, was the same thing as running out of oxygen. They ran out of morphine and plasma and bandages, while the wounded lay in the open among the boulders. And men who could have been saved in an aid station 3 miles away died where they were because there was no way to reach them. On the 10th, at around 4:30, 12 C-47s came over at 300 feet and dropped supply packs. Roughly half of them drifted into German hands. What the Americans recovered was mostly food and ammunition. No medical supplies, no batteries. And that is when the artillery battalion, 3 miles behind them, did something that has no real precedent. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wyman, commanding the 230th, ordered 10 smoke shells opened up. His staff pulled out the smoke canisters and the base ejection charges and packed the empty projectiles with bandages, dressings, sulfanilamide, and morphine syrettes, then replaced the steel disc in the nose so the fuse wouldn't ruin the contents. 4 more shells were filled with sand to the same weight, to be fired first for adjustment. Then a radio message went up to the hill explaining what was coming and how to open it. The adjustment was finished around 9:30 at night. Then they fired medicine at their own men. Physics took its cut. The plasma didn't survive the shock of the barrel or the impact on the rocks. Bandages came out crushed. Some rounds were never found in the dark. But bandages came out, and morphine came out, and penicillin came out. And Frank Denius, a 19-year-old observer from Athens, Texas, up there with the rest of them, remembered the faces of the wounded men when the medicine reached them. He could still see those smiles decades later. Now hold the whole picture, because this is the moment the question changes shape. 6 days of shelling, half the garrison down. No supply, no medicine, dying batteries, every physical condition the German army could possibly impose on a defended position, imposed in full. And the hill never stopped firing. Not the men on it, the hill. Because every hour of those 6 days, Weiss and Bartz and Denius kept talking into their radios. And every time they talked, German columns on the roads below came apart. The 230th alone fired 8,000 rounds during the battle. The German counterattack that was supposed to reach Avranches and the sea reached neither. So ask the question again, and ask it precisely this time. What would the Germans have needed to destroy? Not the men. They killed and wounded 300 of them, and it made no difference to the volume of fire coming down. Not the guns. The guns were 3 miles west, dug in, invisible, and out of reach of everything the Germans had on that battlefield. Not the observation post. There was no observation post. There were men lying in rocks, and there were 3 separate observer parties, and losing one changed nothing. The killing power on Hill 314 was not on Hill 314. The Germans spent 6 days attacking a place that was, in the only sense that mattered, empty. And the German command was not stupid. They worked this out. Somewhere behind the American line stood the guns that were actually doing the killing. And if you cannot silence the eyes, you silence the guns. They tried exactly that. What they discovered when they tried it changed how German artillery fought for the rest of the war. And it had nothing to do with accuracy. Before we go looking for those German guns, I need to give you a number. It is the least dramatic number in this entire story, and it explains more than any other single fact you will hear today. Artillerymen in every army of the Second World War divided their work into 2 categories, and the difference between them is the difference between annoying an enemy and removing him. The first is neutralization. You put enough steel onto a position that the men in it stop shooting, stop moving, stop thinking, and press themselves into the earth. It is cheap, it works fast. It also stops working the moment the shelling does. Neutralization does not kill a position, it pauses one. The second is destruction. Actual destruction, the military definition, the one in the manuals, meant putting roughly 30% of the defenders out of action. Kill or wound 1 man in 3, and a unit ceases to function as a unit. Here is what that costs. To militarily destroy a target occupying 100 yards by 100 yards, the estimates of the period ran to about 600 shells. 600 rounds into a square the size of a couple of city blocks. Now do something with that number. An American rifle company on the defensive did not sit in a 100-yard square. At Dom Butgenbach, one American battalion held a front of over 2,000 yards. Even a single company frontage swallows several of those squares, and each one wants its own 600 rounds. And every one of those shells has to be fired by a gun that is standing still, in a known place, for as long as the shoot takes. That is the trap. Not accuracy. Time. Destruction is not a marksmanship problem. It is a problem of staying in position, firing steadily, for long enough. And by the summer of 1944 on the Western Front, a German battery that stayed in position and fired steadily was a battery that died. Let me show you why, through the eyes of the men it happened to. Picture a German gun crew somewhere in Normandy in July. The guns have arrived, and arriving was already the hard part, because a great deal of German artillery still moved behind horses, and horse-drawn guns manage perhaps 25 miles a day before the animals have to rest. The battery is a museum. Field Marshal Hans Eberbach, commanding 5th Panzer Army against the British, later wrote that his artillery included guns from every major power in Europe. Every different gun needs its own ammunition, its own firing tables, its own spare parts, in a supply system being bombed daily. The crew is now waiting for one thing before they can fire. Not an order. Silence in the sky. Because 2 miles up and a few miles back, there was a small olive-drab aeroplane loitering. An L-4, a militarized Piper Cub with a radio and an extra window cut in the roof so the observer can look up as well as down. 2 of them were issued to each American artillery battalion. The effect of that aeroplane on German gunnery is one of the most quietly astonishing facts of the war, and it was noticed in every theater. When American spotter planes were up, German batteries generally did not fire at all. They waited for dawn or dusk, put out a few rounds, and stopped. Not because they were ordered to, because firing while that aeroplane was overhead was suicide, and every crew knew it. So the German gunner's day was structured around a clock he did not control. Fire briefly, move, wait. Fire briefly, move again. Which means that whatever else German artillery could do on the Western Front, it could not do the one thing that destruction requires. It could not stay. Now put the two halves together. To knock out an American position, the Germans needed 600 rounds into every 100-yard square that position occupied, delivered continuously, from guns holding one location long enough to complete the shoot. What they had instead was a doctrine of the short, violent surprise concentration. Hit hard, hit fast, then get out. Because that was the only kind of fire that let a battery survive to fire again. That is why the Hürtgen barrage lasted about half an hour rather than half a day. It was not a decision about tactics. It was a decision about staying alive. And they could not have afforded the ammunition, even if they had owned all the time in the world. The German artillery supporting 5th Panzer Army in Normandy was firing something on the order of 1/10 of what the British were putting out. That is not a shortfall. That is a different war. You want to know what American ammunition supply looked like from the inside? In March of 1945, one battery of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion fired its 300,000th round since coming into combat in June. One battery, 4 guns. So here is where the answer stands, and notice that it has quietly turned into something bigger than a story about artillery. Every German bombardment of an American position carried an expiry date built into it, not chosen, imposed, by the aeroplane overhead, by the counter-battery guns waiting to answer, by the trucks that never came with enough shells. The German gunner could hit you. He could hurt you badly for 20 or 30 or 90 minutes, and then, whether his job was finished or not, he had to stop. The American Army built its entire defensive system around what happens after the shelling stops. That is the hinge. Not thicker earth, not tougher men. A defensive system designed around the certainty that the enemy's fire had a deadline, and that everything, therefore, depended on what your position could do in the 60 seconds after the last round fell. Now, a system like that has an obvious weak point, and any competent enemy would go straight for it. If the killing power of an American position lives somewhere else, in guns miles away, then the whole thing hangs on a thread. A radio, a telephone wire, a 22-year-old with field glasses. Cut the thread, and the position is deaf, blind, and finished. On the 21st of December, at Dom-Buchenbach, the Germans cut the thread. For 3 full hours, an American battalion had no communication of any kind with its artillery. And the shells kept coming. 3 hours before dawn, December 21st, 1944. A low ridge in front of the hamlet of Dom-Buchenbach, 4,500 yards west of the American anchor at Würzfeld. The American Foxhole line here was easy to find. Someone had dug it along a double row of trees, and behind it stood a handful of farm buildings. From the German side, that line of trees was a ruler drawn across the landscape. Holding it was the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, a man who had taken a doctorate at Clemson before the war, and now commanded 1,000 yards of frozen Belgium. I told you to remember this battalion. This is the one that was taken apart on the edge of the Hurtgen 3 weeks earlier. Companies E and F virtually annihilated. Company G shattered. Rifle companies now standing at about 100 men each, 9/10 of them replacements. Men who in many cases had joined the outfit days before. 7 officers left from the roster at the beginning of December. 2 heavy machine gun platoons manned by gunners who had never fired in action. Not enough automatic rifles. Not enough grenade launchers. Against them, the Germans had finally assembled everything. The entire 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, at least a battalion of tanks from the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, and the guns and rocket launchers that had been battering the twin villages to the north, released at last after repeated pleas from the 12th SS. At around 3 in the morning it started, and this time the Germans did not do the short, sharp raid. This time they did everything the Doctrine asked for. Guns, mortars, tank fire, and Werfers, together, on that line of trees. Now, pay very close attention to what this bombardment achieved, because the American official history is completely honest about it, and it is not a story of German failure. The fire continued unremittingly until first light in the east. It inflicted many casualties. It destroyed weapons by direct hits. It tore large gaps in the main line of resistance. American counter-battery fire went out in reply, and it was intense. And it failed. It did not stop the German shelling. Read that again slowly. Many casualties. Weapons destroyed by direct hits. Large gaps torn in the main line of resistance. And the American guns could not shut it down. That is a successful bombardment by any standard any army has ever used. If you had been a German artillery commander watching the observed results come in, you would have reported, correctly, that the enemy's forward line had been broken up. And then, in the gray light, the Panzer Grenadiers came across the open fields in assault formation, walking into a position that by every measure had just been wrecked. Here is what happened next, and it is the single most important thing in this entire investigation. The American forward observers, men lying out in that wrecked line in the holes that had just been shelled for 3 hours, called for a defensive barrage to box their own front. Not near their front, around it. A wall of shell fire placed against the outside edge of their own foxholes. Close enough that fragments from American guns were landing among American men. 10 field artillery battalions ultimately joined that shoot. 10. And they were not all from the same division. Batteries of the 2nd and the 99th Divisions had been tied into the 1st Division's fire control system, which meant a lieutenant lying in the mud outside Dombutenbach could reach across divisional boundaries with a sentence into a radio. Over the 8 hours that followed, the Regimental Cannon Company, the 1st Division Artillery, the 406th Field Artillery Group, and reinforcing batteries from 2 other divisions fired more than 10,000 rounds in support of that one battalion. 10,000 rounds. Remember the number from earlier? 600 rounds to destroy a 100-yard square. The Americans were spending, in 8 hours, what an entire German corps could not have spent in a week. Some tanks did get through the storm. They broke the right flank, overran 2 platoons of the Regimental Anti-Tank Company, then drove along the hedgerows, deliberately hunting the machine guns, which had no defense against moving steel. 3 of them reached the buildings and fired point-blank into the barns where Daniel and his command post group were fighting. A tank destroyer of the 634th caught 7 panzers in succession as they came one by one over the ridgeline. And now the detail that should have decided everything. For one period of 3 hours during that fight, all communication between the hard-pressed rifle battalion and the artillery broke down under German fire. 3 hours. No wire, no radio. The thread cut, exactly the vulnerability that the whole American system supposedly hung on. This is the moment the German plan was built for, whether or not anyone on their side realized it had arrived. And the American shells continued to arrive with devastating effect. That sentence sits in the official history without fuss, and it is the answer to the question you've been carrying since Hürtgen. The fire did not stop when the talking stopped, because the fire did not depend on the talking. Those concentrations had been planned in advance, plotted, numbered, and held in fire direction centers miles to the rear. The observers had done that work days earlier, the same thing Weiss and Bartz did on Hill 314 the day before the Germans arrived. When the wire went dead, the guns simply kept executing the plan that already existed, onto ground the Germans had to cross. When it was over, an American patrol walked into the woods from which the final assault had come and counted 300 German dead. That is probably why the tanks that reached Daniel's command post arrived alone. Their infantry was lying in the trees behind them. The commander of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division told his superiors he could not attack again. And in the late afternoon, Daniel paid the gunners the compliment that infantrymen reserve for artillery. He said he didn't know where they got the ammunition, or when they found time to flush the guns. He said 100 Germans came at one of his platoons, and not one of them got through. But the whole thing rested on the men who had made that plan, and who called that barrage onto their own heads. And the life expectancy of those men was being measured in days. In one artillery battalion on that ridge, of 48 forward observers, 32 were gone inside 6 days. So if the observers were dying that fast, who was left to call the fire? 48 forward observers went to work with the 15th Field Artillery Battalion on Elsenborn Ridge. 6 days later, 32 of them had been evacuated for wounds or exposure. 2 out of 3. In under a week. That is not a statistic about bad luck. It is a statistic about the job. The forward observer's whole purpose was to be where he could see the enemy, which meant being where the enemy could see him. At Krinkelt and Rocherath, the American history notes, almost in passing, that losses among the artillery observers were unusually high, and then moves on, because everyone involved already knew. So if the men who carried the radios were being killed at that rate, and the fire never faltered, then the fire cannot have depended on those particular men. It didn't. And this is the layer underneath everything you have heard so far. December 18th, 1944, just before 8:30 in the morning, on the road east of Rocherath. The fog that had covered the fight all night lifted, and 3 German tanks drove straight down the American Foxhole line, machine guns working, with infantry rushing forward behind them. Lieutenant Stephen Truppner of Company A, 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry, got on the radio and reported that his company had been overrun. Then he asked for artillery to be fired onto his own position. An American battalion shelled that ground for 30 minutes. 12 men came out of Company A alive. I am not going to dress that up. There is nothing to add to it. But I want you to notice something technical inside it, because it matters enormously. Truppner was not an artillery officer. He was an infantry company commander. And he was able, in the middle of being overrun, to speak into a radio and have a field artillery battalion place its entire fire onto a grid square within minutes. Now hold that thought and go back 2 days and 10 miles north to Hürtgen on the 16th. When the German infantry broke into the village, Lieutenant Colonel Butler picked up a telephone and called the forward observer of the 196th Field Artillery Battalion, a young officer named Llewellyn, whose observation post was a 3-story brick building sitting in the forward line, and whose little party was at that moment fighting Germans off the ground floor. Butler asked for 3 5-minute concentrations on his own positions. The shells came in promptly. When the fire lifted, Butler sent his reserve, 1 platoon, into the counterattack, picking up strength from the Foxhole line as it went, and drove the survivors back out of the village. Over the course of those days, Butler's battalion called fire onto or beside its own positions at least 6 separate times. Same pattern again on the 22nd of December, on the 9th Division front, where Sergeant Peter D'Alessandro of Company E found his position collapsing and made a last stand with grenades and an abandoned machine gun. When he could hold no longer, he called for a mortar barrage on top of himself. He survived, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor. An infantry lieutenant, a battalion commander, a sergeant, Now watch it happen one level lower still. July 17th, 1944, in the Normandy hedgerows. A forward observer party from the 230th Field Artillery is working ahead of the American line when German machine gun fire kills the officer in charge. The party does not withdraw. Frank Denius, 19 years old, a private first class, a fire control instrument operator, which is to say the man who sets up the equipment, takes over the officer's job. Under fire, he calls, observes, and adjusts the artillery that carries the infantry forward. He gets a Silver Star for it, the first of 4. And on December 22nd, at Bootgenbach, the same man, now a sergeant, had his observation post located by German tanks and taken under direct fire. He stayed in it and kept the artillery coming until the attack was beaten off. Here is the thing I want you to see clearly, because it is the difference between the two armies, and it is not a difference of courage. In the German system, calling artillery fire was specialist work. Their fire planning ran on careful survey, artillery reconnaissance units moving forward to fix positions on the ground, firing data recalculated each day against the weather, worked out on mechanical calculators at a computing center, and sent out by teletype. It was competent. It was also a closed loop. Fire belonged to artillerymen, and shifting a lot of guns onto a target that nobody had surveyed took time the tactical situation rarely gave. In the American system, requesting fire had become a common skill. Fire direction was centralized at battalion. Every battery could, in practice, shoot for anybody, and one observer's request could be pushed up. 3 minutes to add the division, 3 minutes more to add the corps. There is a documented case in Italy of a single Piper Cub pilot calling 5 separate corps-level missions inside 1 hour. On the northern shoulder of the Bulge, 348 guns and a battalion of chemical mortars were placed under the control of one headquarters, so that anyone who could see a target could reach all of them. Which brings us to the answer that the Germans could not have found, no matter how carefully they looked through their instruments. They kept trying to knock out the position by killing the men in it. But the ability to call down the fire of 10 artillery battalions was not lodged in any particular man. It was distributed. It sat in the infantry lieutenant, in the sergeant, in the 19-year-old instrument operator, in the battalion commander with a telephone. Kill the observer, and the company commander does it. Kill the company commander, and a sergeant does it. There was no head to cut off. That is why the pattern held from Normandy to the Rhine. The German gunner's problem was never that he missed. It was that the thing he was trying to destroy had no single point of failure anywhere inside the beaten zone of his guns. And there was one more property of an American position that the German command, I think, never fully allowed itself to believe. An American position that had been destroyed did not stay destroyed. The battalion that stopped the 12th SS Panzer Division at Dom-Bootgenbach on December 21st was, 3 weeks earlier, a battalion that no longer existed. Go back to the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry and look at what was actually holding that line of trees on December 21st. Companies E and F, virtually annihilated on the fringe of the Hurtgen. Company G, shattered. Rifle companies rebuilt to about 100 men each, 9 parts in 10 of them replacements. 7 officers surviving from the December 1st roster. Machine gun crews who had never fired at a German. That is not a veteran battalion. That is a name with new men poured into it. And that name, filled with strangers, held its ground against the entire 25th Panzergrenadier Regiment, supported by SS armor, and broke it, and counted 300 German dead in one patch of woods afterwards. Now think about what that means from the other side of the field. In the Hurtgen, German artillery had done everything an army can ask of artillery. It had genuinely destroyed those companies. That is a rare and expensive achievement, and it was real. And it bought them roughly 3 weeks. Because behind the American line stood something the German army no longer possessed in any meaningful form: a machine for putting a destroyed unit back together. Wounded men off the line and into surgery in hours, replacements arriving in a steady stream, weapons, ammunition, winter clothing, radios, flowing forward continuously, in quantities that meant a division could bleed and stay in the fight. Compare the other side of that ledger. By the middle of July in Normandy, one German division had reported 8,000 casualties, and the entire Army Group B had received just over 5,000 replacements, about 12% of what it had lost. Field Marshal von Kluge told the High Command bluntly that the defense might not hold because he could not afford the casualties. That is the asymmetry that makes everything else in this story work. When German artillery destroyed an American position, it removed that position from the war temporarily. When American artillery destroyed a German position, it removed it permanently. And now I can give you the answer to the question we started with, in full. The Germans could hit American positions, but never knock them out, because a defended American position in 1944 was not a place, and it was not a group of men. It was a claim on fire. The men in the holes were not the weapon. They were the eyes and the anchor for a weapon that lived several miles behind them, spread across dozens of batteries, coordinated through fire direction centers that could mass everything within range onto one grid square in minutes, executing plans already drawn up before the attack began. To knock that out, German artillery would have had to destroy, at the same moment, 4 separate things. The men in the holes, who were replaceable in days. The observers, who were interchangeable with anyone else present. The communications, which failed for 3 hours at Buchenbach and changed nothing. And the guns themselves, which were beyond their reach and protected by an aeroplane that made German batteries afraid to fire at all. They could reach exactly one of those 4, and it was the one that grew back. That is why the German gunner's experience was so maddening. His shells landed where he sent them. His observations were correct. His reports were honest. And the enemy line kept killing his infantry, because he had never once been shooting at the thing that was doing the killing. Now, having spent 1944 learning that they could not destroy an American position, the Germans got to spend the last weeks of that year finding out what the reverse looked like. There was a device the Americans had held back for 2 years, a small radio set built into the nose of an artillery shell, sturdy enough to survive being fired out of a gun barrel, which detected the ground rushing up and detonated the shell in the air above it. The proximity fuse. The men called it the funny fuse. It had been available for a long while and had been forbidden over land, for one reason: the fear that a dud would fall into German hands and be copied, and then used against the bomber fleets over Germany. The release for general use had been scheduled for Christmas Day, 1944. The German offensive began 9 days early, and the restriction was lifted inside a couple of days. Understand what that put into American hands. Everything the Germans had achieved in the Hürtgen with tall fir trees, bursts overhead, fragments coming straight down into holes, the Americans could now produce anywhere, over open ground, in any weather, without needing a forest to do it for them. And they could produce it in the volumes we have been talking about, 10,000 rounds in 8 hours for a single battalion's front. The effect on the German infantry was immediate, and it was psychological as much as physical. Prisoners spoke repeatedly of what those airbursts did to men at night. An American intelligence report noted that German commanders had begun offering a reward to any soldier who could bring in an intact fuse. Patton wrote to Washington that the new shell was devastating and that he was glad the Allies had thought of it first. The Germans, that winter, learned what it feels like when the other side can genuinely destroy a position. They were being taught it by an enemy who had spent 5 months proving it could not be done to them. Which brings us back to Elsenborn, and to the end of the argument. By the 23rd of December, the 12th SS Panzer Division had thrown in the sponge at Buchenbach. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, caught by American artillery as its assault waves were still forming, could not make a second attempt. The 277th and the 326th Volksgrenadier Divisions had both been fought out. 4 American infantry divisions now stood on organized ground from Monschau to Weissmess, and the northern shoulder of the German offensive was jammed shut. But somebody still had to try one more time. On the 26th of December, a fresh German division was ordered to attack the Elsenborn Ridge. What happened to it took less time than it will take me to describe it, and it is the cleanest answer to the question in this whole film. December 26th, 1944. The open, rolling ground east of the Elsenborn Ridge. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division formed up for the attack. The men in it were conscripts, most of them new, sent against high ground held by the 99th Infantry Division, an outfit that 10 days earlier had been the greenest division on the American front, and that the German plan had counted on brushing aside in a morning. The attack was cut down virtually at the moment of its start, not after it had crossed the fields, not at the wire, at the moment of its start. Because from the ridge, American observers were watching the assault waves form, and the concentration of an entire American corps was already plotted onto the ground where they were standing. The men on that ridge had blasted their foxholes out of frozen earth with explosives because shovels would not cut it. The holes had been roofed with felled timber. Communications had been laid in redundant lines. Likely approaches had been registered weeks earlier. Every lesson of the previous 5 months was standing on that hill, and none of them were about how to survive shelling. They were all about how to keep killing after the shelling stopped. At sunrise on the 27th, Sepp Dietrich and his 6th Panzer Army, the formation Hitler had personally chosen to carry the main effort of the entire offensive, were sitting east of a ridge they could not take. The main effort had already been handed to somebody else a week before. Go back now to where we started. Hürtgen, 5:25 in the morning, December 16th. The wire cut, the searchlights on the clouds. 600 men underground, one of them joking about 2 overworked horses. Sometime after that, in a prisoner cage behind the American lines, a German officer captured in front of that village, a lieutenant who had commanded the 5th Company of the 753rd Volksgrenadier Regiment, asked his interrogator a question. He wanted to know which unit had defended Hürtgen. He was told, the 3rd Battalion, 395th Infantry. He said it must have been one of their best formations. It wasn't. It was a battalion of draftees that had been in the line for about 6 weeks, in its first serious action of the war, holding a village it had been told would be a quiet place to spend the winter. What became of them? Lieutenant Colonel McClernand Butler stayed in command until the 30th of April, 1945, when he collapsed from exhaustion. The war ended 6 days later. He went home to Illinois, worked for the telephone company in the town of Ottawa, and grew old there with his wife Madge. Robert Weiss came off Hill 314 on the 12th of August 1944 with about half the men he had gone up with. He became a lawyer in Portland, Oregon, and in 1998 he finally wrote the whole thing down because the men on that hill had never had anyone tell it. Frank Denius went home to Texas with 4 silver stars and 2 Purple Hearts, enrolled at the University of Texas in October of 1945 at the age of 20, took degrees in business and law, and spent the next 70 years in Austin. He died in 2018, aged 93. Lieutenant Stephen Truppner's company came out of the fight east of Rocherath with 12 men. So here is the answer, as simply as I can put it. German artillery could hit American positions all day long, and it did. What it could never do was knock one out, because the thing that made an American position deadly was never inside it. The killing power sat miles behind, in guns the German gunner could not see, reachable by any American who could see him. Kill the men, and replacements arrived. Kill the observer, and a sergeant took the radio. Cut the wire, and the shells came anyway, off a plan already written. They spent 5 years perfecting the art of putting steel on a map coordinate, and they never understood that they were shooting at an address where nobody lived. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If this told you something you hadn't heard before, about the observers, about Hill 314, about a battalion of draftees at Hürtgen, then a like genuinely does help. It's the thing that decides whether a story like this reaches other people who care about it or quietly disappears. Subscribe and hit the bell if you'd like to be there for the next one. And tell me where you're watching from. I read the comments, and the map they draw always surprises me. If somebody in your family was in this war, an artilleryman, an infantryman, a man who carried a radio for a living, I'd like to hear his name and where he served. This channel exists because those names are still worth saying out loud.